Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Patriots History. Hang on, let me fix a couple of things. That's better. All right. Welcome to Patriots History. I'm Larry Swikart, your host, co-author of Patriots History of the United States, now in its 43rd printing. And if you want the 20th anniversary edition, as we call it, which is a brand new chapter in PDF, covering the years 2018 to 2023, email me at larry@wildworldofhistory.com and I'll send it right out to you. I know we're late in the season. Most of you have already made your curriculum choices, but if you haven't, take a look at the US and the world history curriculum here at the Wild World of History. We also have a special offer for Classical Conversations parents who are wedded to CC. You don't want to completely give up that curriculum, but you want some of what this curriculum has to offer. Email me at larry@wildworldofhistory.com. I have a special offer for you that involves the videos only. So give me an email. Kind of a different topic, but on the side of politics, and you can always get me over at the Wild World of Politics, where you can get me talking politics, doing analysis 3 days a week, Monday, Wednesday, Friday, for about 10-15 minutes each day, plus ongoing video series over there if you're part of the Insider. But just a heads up, I will be doing a live election night broadcast, as I did in 2020 when we had 800,000 viewers. Put it together on the spur of the moment, and we're estimating at least 2 million this time around. I'll be with Seth Keschel and Ash Epp, and we're going to be doing a 6-hour election night coverage. Honest, fair, accurate, we hope funny. So tune in, Decision USA 2024. And you can check it out at Decision USA Online. That's decisionusaonline.com. You can find out all the details, all the background of me, Seth, and Ash. Great gear. We got some good gear on there. So check it out, Decision USA Online. All right. As always, I am doing this from the 15th anniversary edition, this reading. If you have an earlier edition, the pages aren't going to line up. The paragraphs aren't going to line up. Some of the headers will line up, but you're better off reading it from the 15th anniversary edition. Let's see, I think that's it. So we are in the Wild West, the chapter 11, called Lighting Out for the Territories, and I am on page 420, and the header, The Indians' Next to Last Stand. Since colonial times, interaction between whites and Indians had followed a remarkably similar pattern, regardless of the region in which those interactions took place. Upon first contact, Indians and non-Indians were often peaceful toward one another and made many important cross-cultural exchanges: food, language, religion, medicine, military techniques, and material culture, tools, weapons, clothing, and so forth. However, this initial peace was always followed by conflict over land, which would lead to a land treaty and then more misunderstanding and anger, and eventually a war, which always ended in Indian defeat. This, in turn, resulted in either the extermination or expulsion further west of native Indian peoples. By the time of the Civil War, nearly all Indians east of the Mississippi either were dead, buttoned up on small reservations, or pushed westward, where this same cycle of relations started anew. Now, I want to mention that when you get the free update, the 20th anniversary edition of Patriots History, among other things, you're going to get 20 pages of new research and material that I found since we wrote the last edition. And one of these is a new book on Indians. Let me just get his name. It's a Scandinavian name. I want to make sure I get it right. Hold on. Okay, the book is called Indigenous Continent by Pekka, P-E-K-K-A, Hämäläinen, Hamalainen. I assume he's Scandinavian. And his take is both old and new. It's old in the sense that he portrays the Indians as engaging in dealing with whites as just another group of Indians. This is quite common with this scholar Richard White in his book, The Middle Ground, that at first, especially before, and it took maybe 100 years before word got totally out to everybody that the whites were not just another Indian tribe, that they were, in terms of technology and military techniques, vastly superior, that Indians dealt with whites as they would any other Indian tribe. And Hämäläinen's view, which I think is wrong, is that the Indians always got the better of the whites. They were always smarter, more clever, and so on, but they always lost. But he portrays them as always outfoxing the whites, and argues that one of the main problems, and I think this is true, is that whites did not understand how to negotiate or bargain with Indians in terms of their culture, understanding how you gave certain types of gifts and who you dealt with and so on and so forth. Fine, okay, I agree. But the point we're going to make here that you'll see over and over again is the Indians did simply not understand the concept of private property when it came to land. And that was just a massive barrier that the two groups could not cross. So anyway, back to the text. Indians of the Trans-Mississippi West were diverse regional groups inhabiting the plains, Rocky Mountains, and Pacific coast. Relocated tribes, Eastern Indians such as the Cherokee, Creek, Delaware, Shawnee, Miami, occupied tracts of land directly west of the Mississippi or in the Oklahoma Indian Territory. Along the Pacific shore from Alaska to Northern California, coastal Indians such as the Puyallup, Maca, Tlingit, Nisqually, Chinook, and others lived in abundance and created sophisticated art, architecture, religion, and material culture. When I say sophisticated, I mean sophisticated relatively. None of them had steel implementations. None of them knew how to make steel or even the wheel. In terms of what European economic and physical culture would be, they were still fairly primitive. And I think it's important that people, unfortunately, come to grips with that. To pretend that they weren't, that they were some magical, super advanced society, then will lead you to false conclusions about why they lost all the time. In the southwestern mountains, Hopi and Navajo herded livestock and farmed corn. Neighboring Apache hunted and gathered on horseback, like the vast majority of the Columbia Plateau, Yakima, Spokane, and Nez Perce, the Indians of the Great Plains. The Great Plains Indians, located in between the relocated Indians and the West Coast Plateau and the mountain tribes, constituted the most formidable barrier to white settlement. Now, let me make this clear. Many Indian tribes hated each other. We've been over this before. The last of the Mohicans, okay, were killed by other Indians. That's the reason they were the last of them, the Huron. Same thing with the Plains Indians. The Sioux and the Cheyenne were arch enemies, which is why we will see that Sitting Bull was such a great chief, an incredible diplomat, because he got these two arch enemies, lifelong enemies, to work together against Custer and the white man. The Hopi and the Navajo to this day do not get along. I live in Arizona. About 1/4 of Arizona in the northern part is Navajo land, with the Hopi land in a little chunk right in the middle of Navajo territory. And many times the Navajo have tried to cut off the Hopi's water and basically drive them out. So there are still animosities and still problems between Indian tribes. They did not all get along. At one time, Plains Indians had been farmers. Introduction of the horse by Europeans I hate to keep doing this, we got to be accurate, reintroduction of the horse. Horses had been in America before Columbus got here. We've seen cave paintings of horses prior to Columbus's arrival. So apparently there had been wild horse herds that died out or were killed. Reintroduction of the horse by Europeans literally transformed the world of the Plains tribes. Once they had the horse, hunting buffalo became much easier, turning the Indians into nomads who roamed the prairie in search of the herds. These herds, by any assessment, were vast at the time the first whites encountered them. Colonel Richard Dodge wrote in 1871, quote, "The whole country appeared to be one mass of buffalo," unquote, an observation similar to that of Thomas Farnham in 1839 on the Santa Fe Trail when he watched a single herd cross his line of sight for 3 straight days. To say that the animals covered the interior of America is not so much of an exaggeration. They did not last long, however. Even before the introduction of the horse, Indians had hunted bison, though not nearly as effectively. They tracked herds on foot, often setting fire to the grasslands in a massive box. This is known as box burning, surrounding a herd except for a small opening through which the panicked animals ran and were slaughtered in the hundreds. So it was not just the whites who killed the buffalo in mass. It was the Indians too. Frequently, though not universally, Indians destroyed entire herds using fire or running them off cliffs. One Indian spiritual belief, not all, but one, held that if a single animal escaped, it would warn all other animals in the region. So you had to kill them all. And other Indian concepts of animals viewed the animal population as essentially infinite, supplied by the gods. A Canadian tribe believed that the buffalo came from a great lake and were infinite. Eco-historians agree that although hunting by the Plains Indians alone did not threaten the bison with extinction, when combined with other natural factors, including fire and predators, ready for this? Indian hunting may have put the buffalo on the road to extinction over time, regardless of the subsequent devastating impact of white hunters. Now, that's one of my chapters in 48 Liberal Lies About American History. It's very important because as I was writing that chapter before we wrote this originally, 3 separate books came out, 2 of them by Ivy League historians. One by Shepard Kretsch III, another one by a professor, Dan Flores, I think, from University of Montana, Missoula. Can't remember who the third guy was. He was one's from Princeton, one's from Yale, and one's from University of Montana. All 3 came to the exact same conclusion that they did all these studies of the carrying capability of the land, and they all concluded the Indians were on their way to making buffalo extinct if a single white had never arrived. That is, if there had never been a Buffalo Bill Cody, the Indians would have driven the buffalo out of business. The fatal weaknesses of the Plains nomads regarding the buffalo was expressed by traveler John McDougall when he wrote of the Blackfeet Indians in 1865, quote, "Without the buffalo, they would be helpless. And yet the whole nation did not own a single one," unquote. Crucial difference is that the Indians did not herd and breed the very animal they depended on. So isn't that interesting? These supposedly advanced tribes had not developed buffalo breeding or herding or corrals because that needs to involve private property. You see how this works? I mean, it's a problem. No system of surplus accumulation existed. That's very important. I mean, we're taking our time on this, but it's important that you kids understand what this implies. When you do not have a Western style system of private property with written titles and deeds, you have no incentive to grow more, to plant more trees than you cut down, okay, to raise more crops than you take out, to leave the land fallow, to raise more buffalo. So sooner or later, you're going to kill them all off. Since the entire source of wealth could rot and degrade, none could exist for long. Moreover, the nomadic life made it impossible to haul much baggage, and therefore personal property could not be accumulated. Big problem. Thus led fur trader Edward Denig to conclude that this deficiency prevented the plains nomads from storing provisions and made them utterly dependent on European trade goods. So it is their inability, their lack of Western land and private property concepts that made them totally dependent on the Europeans, who would eventually be their enemies and their victors. A great eco-myth has appeared, however, about the Indians and their relationship with the buffalo, wherein the Indians are portrayed as the first true ecologists and environmentalists. Nothing could be further from the truth. Traveler after traveler reported seeing herds of rotting carcasses in the sun, often with only a hump or a tongue gone. Okay, so if you attended a public school, at some point you would always hear this line: "Oh, you know, the Indians used all parts of the buffalo." Now, what that makes you see in your mind is, here's a buffalo, here come the Indians, and there's nothing left. I mean, it's like Lizzo on a buffet, right? Gone. But that's not what it meant. That's technically true, but it doesn't mean what you think it does. It means at some time or another, the Indians would end up using all parts of a buffalo, but not all at once. If they needed hides, they would kill a herd, take a little bit of meat, but leave the vast number of herds meat and take the hides only. If they only needed meat, they would take the meat from the animals, but leave all the hides. If they needed bones for their tents and so forth, they'd take the bones and leave the hides and the meat. What's interesting about that phrase, "oh, you know, the Indians used all parts of the buffalo," is it was precisely the whites who did this. It was the whites who took all the bones and shipped them back to be made into glue and cement and so forth, took all the blood and packaged it up and sent it back to be used for paint, took the hides and sent them to be used for belts and shoes and everything else, and of course, took the meat for the railroaders. In reality, it was the white hunters who did what the Indians are credited with doing, which is using all parts of the buffalo at one time. Okay. While the bison was, as Tom McHugh claimed, quote, "a tribal department store with horns used for arrows, intestines used for containers, skins and hides for teepee coverings and shields, muscle for ropes," it's misleading to suggest that Indians did not wantonly slaughter buffalo at times. Father Pierre Desmay observed an Assimilation hunt in which 2,000 to 3,000 Indians surrounded an entire herd of 600 bison and killed every one. Aside from their own deprivation, which they could only notice when it was too late to prevent, the Indians had no way of estimating or tracking the size and health of the herds. And even if they would, nomadic lifestyle made it difficult to enforce mandates without waste. Just no way you can say, okay, we're going to leave some buffalo, because another tribe could come along and take them. It's also meaningless to employ terms like ecological imperialism, which you get in a public school, to describe the interaction of Europeans and the Indians. People of different races and ethnic backgrounds had come into contact with each other globally for centuries, from the Chinese in the Southeast Asia to the Mongols in Europe and the Arabs in Africa. Seeds, germs, animals, viruses have interacted incessantly around the world for eons. Even the European honeybee had settled as far west as St. Louis by the 1700s. To invoke such language as ecological imperialism is an attempt to reattach blame to Columbus and capitalism after anthropologists and historians had discovered that North American Indians had choices in how their world was shaped and made no greater share of right or wrong choices than the new arrivals from Europe. Still, it's unarguable that once a market for buffalo hides, bones, and other parts developed, it paid white hunters to shoot every buffalo in sight, which they tended to do. It is ironically turned the common teaching tool that the Indians used all of the buffalo, meaning they used all parts of the animal, but not at once, on its head. Now, industrialists indeed used almost the entirety of the animal for various products. And you can see pictures of railroad cars taking buffalo bones, buffalo hides, and everything else back east, which would have been left to rot by the Indians. By 1900, fewer than a couple of thousand buffalo remained, at which point the government sought to protect them on federal lands such as Yellowstone National Park, one of the first main refuges. Whatever the numbers, the elimination of the buffalo not only nearly exterminated a species, but it also further diminished the Plains Indians' ability to sustain themselves and pushed them into a lifestyle that made them much more likely to come in conflict with the whites. Having become nomads following the herds as opposed to landowners working farms, whatever concepts of property rights they had held vanished. So too disappeared any need for them to respect white property rights, no matter how questionably gained. After the nomadic culture overtook Plains Indian life, a new culture of hunting with an emphasis on weapons naturally infused their society. Ironically, the nomadic lifestyle at the same time protected the Plains tribes from diseases. And by the way, let me just stop here and note, it was white hunters, white ranchers, white philanthropists who saved the buffalo. Charles Goodnight of the famous Goodnight Loving Trail got some buffalo calves in the 1870s or so and raised them into a herd of over 800 animals that he then donated to Wood Buffalo National Park in Canada that became a herd of 14,000. Ranches began to develop and breed buffalo simply for their meat. Did you know that today more buffalo are bred for their meat than exist in all the national parks put together? We have one ranch in Texas. I think it's called the XY Ranch. I could be, or the YO Ranch. I can't remember. It's a huge, huge ranch. And it raises all sorts of once nearly extinct animals in great, great numbers simply to sell hunting rights. I know you're going to go, oh, well, these animals would not exist if these people had not saved them to have some of them hunted. You breed more and more of them, so you have some to hunt. And so you have more rare antelope on these ranches in Texas than you have in Pakistan, where they came from originally. So J.P. Morgan donated all sorts of land out west as a buffalo preserve. So it was these white philanthropists that saved the buffalo, just as it was John D. Rockefeller and his creating of kerosene was so cheap that it put whaling out of business. And it was John D. Rockefeller, not Greenpeace, that saved the whales. We'll get to that later. Ironically, the nomadic lifestyle at the same time protected the Plains tribes from diseases that ravaged the more stationary Eastern Indian tribes, although a few, such as the assimilation, picked up smallpox and other diseases in neighboring villages and carried them home. It took several encounters with European diseases before Indians discovered that humans transmitted them. But by about 1800, the village Indians had been decimated by diseases, whereas the nomadic tribes were relatively untouched. Thus, not only had the transformation of Indian society by bison hunting actually saved many of the Indians from an early death, but some of the techniques they practiced on the buffalo, riding and shooting, maneuvering, teamwork, also proved valuable in a challenge of a different sort, their wars against the American soldiers. In battle, these Plains Indians could be fierce warriors. They fought while galloping at full speed, dropping and rising at will, and using their horses as shields. This combination of phenomenal horsemanship and skilled marksmanship with a bow, spear, and repeating carbine rifle proved deadly. Ultimately, the U.S. government would spend significant resources, several $100,000 for every single Indian killed, merely exposing the complex and often contradictory problems inherent in federal Indian policy. In the Snake Indian Wars from 1864 to 68, about 2,500 California soldiers, scouts, volunteers defeated the Indians, killing 990 against 168 white losses. Massacres such as the Little Bighorn, that's Custer, and Fetterman were precisely that, isolated events set against a backdrop of the Western way of war employed against an Aboriginal people. Philosophically, American policymakers were divided into camps of preservationists who wanted to keep the Indians as is, exterminationists who wanted to just kill them all. Phil Sheridan was among that group, and assimilationists who wanted to turn Indians into white men, with the latter two dominating policy debate. The preservationists pretty much died out. Preservationists such as Helen Hunt Jackson, author of A Century of Dishonor in 1885, were idealists who proposed simply leaving the Indians alone and free to roam the plains and continue their hunting and gathering lifestyle. Not practical at all. Such romantics, of course, ignored violent Indian conquest and the documented expansion of such empires as the Lakota Sioux, who brutally smashed all opposition in the Great Plains. Equally unrealistic and less humane, intolerant exterminationists argued that preservation and assimilation were both impossible. Indians could never adjust to modernity, said the exterminationists. They had to stand aside for progress because their day was done. And by the way, in every single human society until the United States, this would have been the path they followed, the exterminationist path. You cannot find one anywhere where they said, oh, let's let these people live their own lifestyle, or let's bring them into our society. No, it was kill them, get rid of them, they're a threat. According to this essentially racist view, any Indians who violently resisted reservation confinement should be killed, a sentiment that supposedly originated with General Philip Sheridan, who allegedly said the only good Indians I ever saw were dead. In fact, Sheridan, as commander of the division of the Missouri, supervised many reservations and thought it important to the protection of the Indians to keep them on agency lands, lest the whites kill them. In other words, we're going to keep you jailed up for your own protection. Reality was that the closer one got to the frontier, the more likely one was to see such sentiments expressed. Cleanse the plains, roared the Nebraska City Press, and, quote, exterminate the whole fraternity of Redskins. Whereas the Montana Post called notions of, quote, civilizing the Indians, quote, sickly sentimentalism that should be consigned to novel writers. If the hostiles did not end their barbarities immediately, quote, wipe them out, the paper intoned. Like his predecessor at the Division of Missouri, General William Tecumseh Sherman, Sheridan had no qualms about ruthlessly punishing Indians who strayed off the reservations to commit atrocities, and he renewed efforts to enforce confinement of tribes on reservations. Certainly many soldiers who lost comrades in battles with the Sioux or Cheyenne had no mercy for the Indian. Quote, they must be hunted like wolves, Brigadier General Patrick Connor told Major General Grenville Dodge. The third group, the assimilationists, however, had a realistic view that industrialization and progress made the preservationist ideal impossible, but any effort to exterminate the natives was not only uncivilized, but unchristian and also unconstitutional. Assimilationists argued that Indians must be put on reservations and cured of their nomadic ways for their own protection. The tribes had to learn English, embrace Christianity, and adopt farming and ranching techniques of whites in the hope that they or their children might one day become working men and women in mainstream American civilization. This reservation system was the only, quote, alternative to extinction. This is a phrase coined by one of my professors at Arizona State University in the 1970s, Robert Trennert. But it destroyed Indian culture as effectively as a military campaign, as critics rightly charged. A glaring weakness in the assimilationist position lay in the fact that many of the so-called civilized tribes, like the Cherokee, had already been forced off their lands anyway, regardless of the level of civilization. While the assimilationist views finally prevailed, exterminationist voices remained loud in the halls of Congress, and at times, federal strategy for dealing with the Indians incorporated all three viewpoints. Almost everyone, Indian and white alike, would have agreed that the approach to the Indians was confusing and contradictory. Quote, our whole Indian policy, wrote the editor of The Nation magazine in 1865, quote, is a system of mismanagement and in many parts one of gigantic abuse, unquote. In many ways, the policy only reflected the irreconcilable differences among these three strategies for dealing with Native Americans. And although the task of moving nomadic, warlike Indian people on reservations without incident was in retrospect nearly impossible, the government nevertheless committed avoidable errors. That's a good place for us to stop here this time around, and we'll pick up next time. Also, next time, I will read to you from Present Aspects of the Indian Problem by Carl Schurz, written in 1881. So I'll see you back here next time.